Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another edition of Islam for Europeans. I'm very pleased to have a good friend of mine, someone who has also helped us out with I4E a lot. We have brother Abdur Rahman and his from his channel Knowledge North. How are you doing, brother? Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome, Assalamu wa rahmatullah. I'm doing great, thanks. Pleased to be with you.
Yep, you're coming to us from the north of England. How are things in the north?
Cold. It's starting to get cold and gloomy, but that's part of life here.
Yeah. How cold does it get there in the winter?
Not too bad. I mean, to be honest, relatively speaking, compared to certain parts of Scandinavia, Siberia for that matter, it's no more than maybe -2 or 3 Celsius, so it's bearable. It's just the grey skies are quite depressing sometimes.
Yeah, it's not too bad. I mean, that's like, December, well, November, December in southern Ontario, but sometimes it can get really cold, like -10, -15. So that's if you get like a cold snap.
Nowhere near that bad. I've traveled around a bit. In some places I've been to, like Helsinki in winter. I couldn't touch my face. It was that cold. It's like -25 or something. So comparatively, we've got nothing to complain about.
Right, exactly. All right, so I guess we'll jump right into it. I've been on. I love watching the videos on Knowledge North. It contains some really good information about it. Just talk about like what inspired you to create the website. Oh, just give it, and also give it like a brief explanation for those who are watching who are unfamiliar with your work.
Oh boy, that's a big one. So on the internet, I would say there's basically 2 routes or 2 methods, main ones I've seen anyway, that have presented Islamic knowledge or Islamic learning. There's the scriptural based, whereby you basically have a dars online, an online class based in traditional classical or modernized versions of those classical texts. And then you have a kind of rational debate style philosophical approach using modern Western university type of modes of dialogue and interaction. And with the former, you're basically preaching to the choir. It used to be the case historically that a Muslim, if you were to tell them this is what Allah says, this is what God says, this is what Muhammad says, the final messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then that would be taken as, dare I say, gospel, right? That if it comes from revelation source texts, then that's where you take your religion from. But unfortunately, nowadays, you can't take that as a given, that if you quote someone or if someone is presented what are the primary sources of their religion, that they will take it as something they have to accept, let alone act upon. It's almost like, pick and mix. Well, if I agree with what the Prophet said, fine. Or if that verse makes sense to me from the Quran, fine. If it doesn't, then this is unfortunately.
Rahman, your mic kind of went on us. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can. So
okay, you're back.
Interrupted. Yeah. So unfortunately, it's part of where we are now. And then so you have the other side as well, that is the debate style, the rational approach. I found for the most part it was devoid of any kind of religious heritage or faithfulness to texts. Not that necessarily what they were saying was incorrect, but it wouldn't draw people back to the source of the religion. So that's the gap, if you like, that I thought was there, that there was no referencing from the rationalistic style of presentation of Islam to the classical text. And with the classical text, there was no rational presentation. It was simply take it, accept it, otherwise, this isn't for you. So I thought, considering where we are now, the time we're in and the places we're in a non-Muslim society, where everyone is a skeptic, everyone is encouraged to be cynical, and that's not necessarily a bad thing when it comes to theology, and then one might come from that theological belief in terms of actions, then you have to convince, you have to bring a convincing argument. So to summarize, the purpose or the knowledge gap I thought I found in the internet, on YouTube specifically, was to present classical Islamic understanding, let's say mainstream Orthodox understanding, but then don't assume that the person, the audience, is going to accept you just because it's quoted with a reference from the Quran and the Sunnah. You have to actually explain to them why it's necessary to consider. And as part of that, it was an excuse to bring in lots of other nerdy interests, such as history, ethnography, geopolitics, and other things that have yet to explore, perhaps, aspects of sport or whatever it might be. And so it gave an opportunity to bring all those nerd fests together into one platform, and then hopefully it will pique interest of various audiences, whether they might have thought that these issues could be explained from an Islamic viewpoint or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean it's really important work, and that response is a good segue into my next question, because I remember you talking in a separate interview that one kind of like a lost art in the Islamic sciences is not just taking Islamic history. I mean, as we know, if I'm not mistaken, we get our takings from the religion from the Quran, the Sunnah, and the first three generations of the Muslims, the Tabi'in, the Sahaba, the Tabi'in, and the Tabi'in. But apart from that, you have 1,300 years of Islamic history, and I find that many, of the, I guess celebrity da'is that you see on YouTube, or just Muslims in general, they always refer back to this time in history and say that they kind of want it back. But what you're suggesting in what you referred to is applying, I guess what's called the applied Islamic history, if I'm not mistaken, where you look at what happened in those times, and we learn from it, not to copy and paste what happened in the past, but so we can sort of take that as reference to what's happening in the 21st century, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, there's two things here, a coalescing of two different disciplines, if you like. So first of all, in terms of history, Islamic history, what you'll find more often than not is what we'd call popular history, which is biographical, is to do with Islamicate history as opposed to Islamic history. Islamicate being anything to do with the Muslim civilization, whether it was Islamic or not. So if I pronounce his name right, Maimonides, the Hebrew philosopher, polymath, he was not a Muslim, but he was part of Islamic civilization. So he would fit into Islamicate history, or the history of Islamic civilization. And more interesting for many Muslims than that, for the purposes of boosting their iman, their faith, and making them feel proud of their religion, is where you look at biographical history. Of course, first and foremost would be the Prophet ﷺ and his companions, and then you would have heroes and generals and conquerors and scholars and whatnot. And then moving away from that, you have what we'd call Islamic history, which is the history of, if we've been very pedantic on it, strict on it, the history of Islamic sources, the history of the religion, which is limited essentially to Quran and Sunnah and whatever agrees with that from consensus. And that is only to do with related to our religion and where we extract our religious information from, our source of our faith from. But there's a gap here because, or what's missing is this fourth thing, which is applied Islamic history, because applied Islamic history is where you see where can the benefit be derived for Muslims in any given situation. Because there's parts of our history, of course, which we would shy away from. There may be excesses from a ruler, there may be heresies, things that would otherwise we would object to, but we can still derive benefit from them, at least in the sense of learning from mistakes or recognizing an evil in order to avoid it. And this is where the crossover is with something that happened in Western geopolitics, if you like, at the early 20th century, following World War I. Some Americans, whose name escapes me at the moment, historians, they concluded that what's missing in the political roundtables when we go into battle, or we entered as America, went into World War I, is a lack of understanding of the history. Had there been the policymakers understood the various ethnic, religious, communal fault lines, then perhaps certain aspects of the war, if not the war itself, could have been avoided. This thing became sharp again after the Iraq War, and in some ways Afghanistan more recently, but certainly with Iraq, where there was completely an absence of understanding of these fault lines, the ethnic tensions, religious sectarian tensions, and as soon as the battle what was thought to be won, then it blew up in another sense in terms of sectarian strife, and then extremism from terrorist organizations, and then geopolitical maneuvering. All of that was kind of potentially avoidable if there was an understanding of the history. So applied history was invented as that term in the US to mitigate against going blind into a conflict without knowing what the end game would look like. Applied Islamic history is a bit different. It's because we have certain religious objectives. So the objectives of Islam in terms are generally, when we're looking at a community-wide understanding of where Islamic society is and wanting to better our current predicament, it would be around two words: tajdeed and tasli or islah. So tajdeed means revival or renewal, and Islam means reformation or rectification. Both of these terms are found throughout the scriptures of Islam, the primary source text. So Islah or reformation or rectification is something you and I can do at the individual level, how we better ourselves as Muslims, and then concentric circles, our families, our societies, our neighborhoods, our ethnic groups, our nations, tribes, national level. Whereas tajdeed is something more on a national or political level, how the ummah itself can be revived. So in studying applied Islamic history, our goal is these two things. It's reformation of the self and society, and then renewal of the ummah at a transnational, if dare we say, political level or global level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's such an important aspect of moving forward as a Muslim community. There are people who would play the devil's advocate and say, we should just forget about history and just all be united as Muslims, and all we need to do is take from the Quran and the Sunnah, and then that will just solve all of our problems. And I think some Islamic leaders at a local level, they had this approach, and I can understand where they're coming from to an extent, because they want the unity of the Muslims, and they saw the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and then as an indication that the Ummah was not unified. But it's almost like they took it to another extreme, not really understanding the geopolitics of all these different nations, and now the fact that they're living in the West. I don't think they really had a lot of foresight as to what that would look like, because this is kind of unprecedented in recent Islamic history, where in major metropolitan cities in the West, you have Muslims from many different backgrounds. You have indigenous Muslim communities, such as the African American Muslim community in the States, and you also have converts, and you mix that all into a bowl, and I can understand the appeal of saying, oh, we should all we should all just discard any differences whatsoever and just be all united as one ummah, but without understanding kind of what precipitated that and all these different things going on. That a lot of their efforts ended up falling short, and I saw that as 18 years of a convert to Islam, is that they're trying to just, there was just a lack of foresight. Was it kind of the same thing in the UK, or was it different, or how would you have looked, what advice would you have given to Muslim leaders in the UK, based on it's kind of like an application of Islamic history?
Well, there's often we find we have a naive approach to reformation or rectification of the plight of the Muslims, wherever they may be, in the UK, elsewhere. And if we're absolutely honest and brutally honest about it, if the hearts aren't united, then real progress isn't going to to be made. There is an element of pragmatism, but essentially you need to be on the same page with everyone that you hope to collaborate with. There needs to be, a uniformity, not just in terms of the superficial, in terms of the endeavor that the people are working together with, but also in terms of what they hold dear in their heart. And it goes right down to the creed itself. Bear in mind, when we look at the earliest expression of Islam for the first century, more or less, the Muslims were united, not just politically, but theologically as well. And in fact, it's because of their theological unity that they had political unity. Once heresies and vested interests and whatever else we want to, how we want to donate the split started to occur within the creedal foundation, the theological religious foundation of Islam, then the politics followed suit, and society itself started fighting itself, or you had civil wars, etc. So likewise today, we're kind of fooling ourselves to think that if people at a creedal level hold vastly contradictory notions about the other, and where they actually believe the other person's destiny will be in the hereafter, how can we expect them to move forward? That's not to say that we can't work together with the other. In fact, the Quran, there's a maxim from the Quran where it says in Surah Maida, so unite all together, work together on righteousness and piety, and do not cooperate on righteousness and piety, and do not cooperate upon sin and transgression. This was actually revealed with regards to working with non-Muslims. Mm-hmm. So we can collaborate with people who are vastly different from us, but you have to be honest about those differences and honest about where the collaboration is going to lead to and what it's for. On that basis, then there is scope for working together. But at the end of the day, really what we want is uniting the hearts, essentially, because that would make, amongst the Muslims that is, because that would make the external unity have a more solid foundation. If we say beliefs and creeds are the foundation, as in a house's foundation, if the foundation of a house is solid, then everything else will rest upon it. But if the foundation of a house is built upon sand, as the Bible says, then everything else will collapse. So that seems to be one thing that we've seen over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry about that, Divest. I know it wasn't on my question list, but I just was curious. Let's see here, but I know that there's differing opinions on how we try to revive Islam in the West, and the hearts and minds of the Muslims. One such movement that's been kind of recent is many Muslims trying to have this sense of Islamic unity and spirit, and revivalism via what we see in Turkey with Erdogan trying making Turkey like a huge world power and big player, trying to bring that back. And I know they always refer to the Caliphate or the Ottoman Empire falling in 1924 and as a tremendously sad moment for the Muslims. So you see a lot of Muslims trying to bring this back. I guess it's kind of referred to as kind of like Neo-Ottomanism. Tell me your thoughts on that, Abdur Rahman, because I want to get to know, because it's such a huge topic, and I know you've covered it on Knowledge North as well. Would you say that on the whole that it's a good thing, or where has it been misguided if it has been?
So it comes from a good place, in the sense that Muslims want to feel hopeful, not just in terms of their day-to-day, but even at the global level as well, at the political level, at the military level, dare we say. And so when you see a power, Muslim power, flexing its muscles and claiming it's doing so on behalf of the Ummah, the global Muslim community, then of course Muslims feel pride in that, and they want to encourage it and see it increase. And of course, Turkey today has a presence in Syria, has a presence in Libya, Azerbaijan, the Eastern Mediterranean, Balkans. There's a lot of soft power. And then through things like the drama series. Its soft power has been has a phenomenal success. I mean, it's a runaway success to the extent that world leaders, non-Muslim world leaders, will quote, snippets of the show, etc. So, in that sense, it does seem to be something which is trendy, sexy, and has a basis in the real world in terms of material advancement, in terms of technological advancement of the Turkish state's military-industrial complex. Its drone technology, for example, is right up there. It's world-class. They essentially won a recent conflict, or rather, they allowed other nations to win conflicts using their technology, their very highly sophisticated drone program. So it gives Muslims hope. Where that's what a Muslim state today, even in the 21st century, even with the way the world is set up, whether in terms of negative, I mean in terms of negative things in the world, such as interest-based system or other kind of restrictions against Islam or various other agendas at play, it shows that potentially a Muslim state, majority Muslim state, can advance technologically, potentially financially, and it can extend and expand beyond its borders with soft power and actually with hard power as well. Another reason why there seems to be a focus on Neo-Ottomanism as opposed to Neo-Abbasidism or Umayyism or even the prophetic Caliphate is recency bias in relative terms to those other states. It's the last big Islamic superpower or superstate was the Ottoman Empire, and therefore it seems to be that, well, that's kind of in cold storage, and Erdogan maybe is trying to get it to thaw. So it's the most likely of all of the historical Islamic superstates or Muslim, I don't want to use the word aggressive, but let's say confident, muscular powers that could be revived because it's the most recent. The flaws with this are many, though. One is that we tend to romanticize the past in order for it to fit into our agenda. And what happens when you romanticize or you whitewash, let's say, a state or an Islamic state of the past, is that you then Islamically you will justify things which are against Islam, and then this harms your dawah or your outreach efforts to non-Muslims or to Muslims who may not be on board with your mission. So, for example, and I'm not saying, I don't want to pick on the Ottoman Empire. I mean, you'll find excesses throughout all Muslim states after the states of the companions, of course. There's our without reproach, the Khulafa Rashidun, what's known as the rightly guided caliphates. After that period, you saw many excesses. So amongst the Ottomans, for example, you had the devshirme, or the boy tax, if you like, a slave system, which, even though it has some nuance, it also had a lot of oppression. And if you want to present Ottomanism as something worthy, then you will maybe try to gloss over that. And that will be a problem now, because many people in the Balkans will object and say that we suffered on account of the devshirme or the slave system.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, the Ottoman Empire is, yeah, I know a lot of Muslims, they romanticize the Ottoman Empire and they love it, but especially for Europeans, it's like the worst possible way to give dawah. I mean, like when they think of the Ottoman Empire, they think of millions of Circassian women being enslaved and like sold off to like harems, and like Barbary pirates enslaving. Yeah. So yeah, continue. But I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I mean, with the Circassian women, they were Muslims. So we're talking, hundreds of thousands of Muslim women. Were sold on slave markets. I'm saying even for a Muslim, like that becomes an issue too. You can't easily gloss over that, as you might be able with other excesses. So, and it's not as if we were looking as Muslims, reflecting on the past, to demean or diminish the excellent work, or work's the wrong word, let's say the brilliant progress or civilizational output of an empire such as the Ottomans. It was, comparatively speaking, it was far more advanced, far more civil, at least up until the 19th century, when it started to nosedive. Up until that point, it was far more civil, far more just, far more tolerant than any of its neighbors, certainly any of its non-Muslim neighbors. But at the same time, we have to be honest about those infractions, those aberrations from a religious point of view, because a political entity is a political entity, and Islam is Islam, and you can't force marriage the two together. Everything as Muslims should be done in reflection of our Islamic principles. And when you do that, when we're honest about that was a bit rough, that was a bit uncalled for, that's not excusable according to the Sharia, if you're honest about it, then you can have a dialogue and celebrate, that's the word I was looking for, celebrate what's good about the past, provided you're honest about what was not so good. And why it's not so good appeals to the strength of Islam, because Islam is the thing, or Islam is that which tells you that it's not good, that that aspect of is oppression, and Islam is oppressive, and Islam is against oppression. Then you are supporting the call to Islam. Whereas if you put everything together, everything that happened in the last 1400 years of Islam, if it was expansionist, therefore it must have been good, then you will damage the reputation of Islam. One example, if I may give, is the law of the sack. So there's this military term, the law of the sack. It's pre-Islamic, and it kind of ended shortly following the Napoleonic wars, whereby it was seen that the right of an army, that if it took a town, it could sack it, i.e. rape and pillage, and they'd normally have 3 days. In fact, it's in the Mongol code, the Yasik, or the code of Genghis Khan, that the commander has that right to rape and pillage. And Napoleon made some statements about it, that what else should the soldier look forward to after having been on a long march and, you know, fighting for the nation, except that he's been able to, he's allowed to let down steam essentially for 3 days or however many days. So this was repudiated by in the European powers in the 18th century, if I'm not mistaken. And Muslim civilizations also engaged in this. When I say civilization, I should say power. Certain Muslim states would engage in the law of the sack, that when they took the conquered territory, then there would be plunder and pillage. This has got nothing to do with Islam, though. The Prophet never did this. So Islam is just and free from such practices. So just because a Muslim state or power does it, doesn't mean that we therefore sanctify it. Rather, we must condemn it. And that does not mean that we throw out the baby with the bathwater, and that we don't celebrate what they did was good as well. And the argument given, well, this is, and I've heard Muslim historians say this, well, this is what happens in war. Yeah, but that's war. Islam is something else, right? Just because it happened doesn't mean it's something that we should not call out. So if you call it out, then you're able to have you're able to move forward and study these things in context.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, if you're not honest about the past, it does a couple of things. One is that, I guess the non-Muslim populace, it's like, it's like the no Scotsman rule, like no true Scotsman rule. Well, if Islam is so great, and you're saying it's so great, and you're using these historical examples, right? Well, I look into this part of history and I see all these. So what makes us think that you're not going to do the same thing? And then for Muslims, I mean, if you're not being honest about history, especially to the Muslim youth, and then they find out, from the other side, like the anti-Islam right or the neo-atheists, a different version of history, and I've seen it firsthand. This can really, really rattle their iman, and lose people to the other side. So, and there's a reason why they're, I guess like the new atheists or the anti-Islam right is using people like Ayan Hirsi Ali and Yasmin Mohammed to sort of draw Muslims away from their deen. And I think you're right. I mean, if we're not honest about history, both the good, the bad, and the ugly, it can have severe negative consequences that I guess like we don't really see firsthand. Would you agree with that, or?
Yeah, and being honest only helps Islam. There's that saying again from the other book, the truth will set you free. Likewise, it's true for Muslims as well, that no matter how nasty it is, the good, the bad, and the ugly, as you say, the fact that you can then contextualize it and then analyze it in light of the Quran and the Sunnah and the source of Islam, then you're able to derive benefit from it, and you only support your mission of outreach or presenting Islam. The Quran itself, of course, is replete with stories of nations who perished, of wicked people such as Pharaoh, Satan himself. There's benefit in accessing that and learning about that, in that we learn what not to do and what are the characteristics of evil. So just because we're Muslims doesn't mean that we should then whitewash, as we say, and say that nothing bad happened and all of that is just Islamophobia. Quite the contrary. We're able then to elevate Islam above all of the infractions, above the aberration, if we're able to, and we can very clearly, unlike perhaps other faith communities, say this is prohibited, this action is reprehensible. Why? Because the Prophet said so in such and such a place, because Allah explained this to be such and such a case, and the result of this in our lifetime is that that state collapsed, or a particular tribe or nation never became Muslim, because they felt aggrieved by this particular practice. And so we're able then to put distance between what we call to and what is righteous, and our own failings historically as to what we claim to be, but we didn't actually live up to those standards.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the examples are several, but again, it doesn't discredit a lot of the good that happened in Muslim societies too. I mean, there's good and bad in every, when you look at history dispassionately, you can see that, it was a different time and a different place. And I think that's, what a lot of, I guess people who are trying to synthesize this scholarship with, providing that information to the general public. I think a lot of that's what they're trying to do. But, let's diverge a little bit into, I guess, other Islamic movements that are trying to, I guess, reestablish the Caliphate, because there's been a lot, and this was very popular in the early 2000s when I first converted, in that there is a sense in the Muslims that success equals having an Islamic state or a Khalifa, and without that, the Ummah is not going to succeed. And that it is tantamount that in order for the Muslims to be unified, there should be one singular Muslim state. So there have been some movements, including in the West, that have tried to bring the Khalifa back. So just talk about what are some of the where does this idea come from, and is it a unified thought within the Muslim scholarship, or what are the issues surrounding that?
So the word caliph, or anglicized from Khalifa, or caliphate from Khilafah, has a linguistic definition or meaning, and a shar'i or religious meaning, technical Islamic meaning in the Sharia. So in the strict confines of the Sharia, the caliphate was the rightly guided succession to the temporal power of the Prophet, which ended 30 years after his passing. And that's based on his own statement, where he said the Khilafah in my Ummah, or the Caliphate in my Ummah, will last 30 years. Then there will be dynastic succession and tyranny and so on and so forth. So, strictly speaking, the caliphs, the rightly guided caliphs were five, and that was Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, and Hassan bin Ali, his son, who had the caliphate for 6 months, more or less. That's not to say that there weren't righteous rulers after them. There were a great many. In all dynasties, you can count righteous heroes, all of them, the Ayyubids, the Mamluks, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, and the Ottomans, plenty, and many more besides. But what distinguished those from even the righteous rulers who came after them was their mode of succession was entirely in conformity with the Sunnah, with the desire of the Prophet, in that it was by consultation. They were elected by Shura, which is a kind of a democratic vote, or the one who had the power nominated someone after him who wasn't from his dynastic line. He didn't insist on that, let's say. Then you have the linguistic meaning of caliphate, which is simply any Muslim ruler in the classical sense. Any Muslim ruler. It could be, even in terms of the rulings, the religious rulings, it could be someone who calls himself a president today. The rules that apply in terms of what a Muslim ruler's obligations are, his rights and responsibilities, doesn't matter if he calls himself a sultan, a king, a caliph, president, premier, he still, he or she, it could be, still has to, still falls within certain Islamic parameters. So this notion then that some of these groups, these Muslim activist groups have, that we need to revive the caliphate, if they're talking, in terms of a global unified, as you mentioned, global unified Islamic state or super state, that collapsed about 120 years after the Prophet passed away. And even in that time, within the first century, you had major schisms, but then they reunited. But certainly since the year 752, when the 754, when the Abbasid Empire inherited the Umayyad Empire before it, but then the Umayyads retained Spain, or they established an independent setup in Spain. From that point onwards, you never had a unified Islamic state ever since that time. They were super states. They were certainly transnational, multi-ethnic, and they would cross 3 continents in some cases, such as the Ottomans and the Mamluks. Europe, Asia, and Africa included, but there was never one single global Muslim power. Roughly a century after the Prophet's death. Therefore, to say all of our problems will be solved, right, if we had this state, well, when did that state exist? For the bulk of the past 1400 years, it did not exist. So already you're starting, on a false premise. That doesn't mean, though, Islam didn't advance. Of course, Islam did advance. Most of the conversions, nations as a whole, converted to Islam or embraced Islam, whilst Islam politically was fragmented, whilst you didn't have a super state. Of course, a state helps in that you have the resources of a state, you have the security of a state, but it doesn't have to be just one global entity. And as we said, it never was one global entity until after, I said, a century out of Islam, but still Islam advanced. So it's almost a poverty of impossible expectations to think that we can go back to think that only when we have a global caliphate, then we will the Islam will rise again. We have it within ourselves to help Islam advance right now. It doesn't require necessarily a unified political force. That would help, but it doesn't mean that an individual state can't do well. For example, the Ayyubids under the famous Salahuddin, they liberated Jerusalem, liberated the Holy Land without the help of a caliphate. In fact, they were opponents to the sitting caliph at that time, the nominal caliph, that is. The Mongols were defeated by non-caliph actors, sultanates and whatnot. In fact, the first army ever to halt the Mongol advance was a European Muslim army of Bulgars in what was then the Kingdom of Volga, Bulgaria, what is now the far eastern part of European Russia. They were the first army to check the advance of the Mongols, and they were independent politically, physically. There was no physical congruence from them and the rest of the Muslim world. They were far in the north, based around what is now Kazan and Tatarstan, etc. So you don't need to do well. You don't need to do well as an individual in terms of your connection with your Lord and increase your iman. Not necessarily politically. Only if you have a global superpower. It can happen at the micro and the macro level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess we have to, think globally, but act locally. But that doesn't seem to be. It seems to be difficult to get this across. I noticed that, for the and I've been around many masjids and tried to act as a consultant for many masjid boards, and they take a very centralized approach even in a masjid, and there's a lot of differing opinions and tensions within a little micro community of Muslims living in a city big or small. So I mean, if it's an incredible challenge to get complete unity within Muslims and have one centralized power or president or imam delegating and running absolutely everything, it must be an even greater challenge to think of that happening on the state level.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, I've been in cities with 40,000 people, in which you had one mosque, and and some of the congregants of the mosque of that city, they opened up their own mosque on the other end of town, and there were like fewer than 100 Muslims. So I mean, and there's no need to have two mosques at that point, but I mean, I think this is what we see even in cities today, in both the Muslim world and the West. I mean, people, they have different issues and different opinions and different schools of thought, and like, even when you try to run these kind of umbrella masjids, like, there's always going to be difference of opinion and, like, quarreling. And this is just part of human nature, I guess. And I think you're right in saying that it's, it's incredibly short-sighted to think that, all Muslims need to be unified under, you have the exact, frame of mind and reference like robots. And only then can we move forward as a Muslim community. And I mean, even on our channel, I mean, we're, like, we're trying to make sure that, we don't turn into like a cult where, our opinion is the only way. And, we're not going to, reach out and communicate with other Muslims, even those who may be opposed on us in some, aspects. But, even in the online world, there's always going to be differences. So, yeah, I mean, but that's really, I mean, it's really good advice, and it's really important for us to know as a Muslim community moving forward. I mean, and it's great that, like, we're actually, alhamdulillah, bringing these issues to light. But did you have anything else to add to that, Abdur Rahman? Or
Well, firstly, it's not what Allah requires of us. We're only required to do what is within our means. We're not expected to save the world, right? Or to get involved in things which we haven't been presented with the ability to affect change on. It's the ayat, the Quranic verses are very, very clear and profound, as are the hadith, that we are required to rectify ourselves and to rescue ourselves and our families, as Allah says in the Quran, save yourselves and your families from the fire. And then again, in circles, it spreads out. And like we said, if the hearts aren't united, how could you possibly have political unity? Really, and this is something which is a philosophical aspect of Islam, if you like, that is lost on many of these activist movements, in that we believe in divine agency. And this is an aspect of faith. One might say, well, of course we do. We're Muslims, we believe in God. No, but Islam actually says there's certain things that are the rights and responsibilities of Allah or God, and others that are the rights and responsibilities of His servants. So in terms of political power, ascendancy, that is the responsibility of Allah. He Himself, from above the seven heavens, has given Himself that charge, provided we do our bit. So, for example, and there's many verses like this. So Allah says, if you help Allah, then Allah will help you and establish your, plant your feet firmly. And one may ask, well, how is it possible to help Allah, who is the one without need? Rather, we are the ones in need. And the explanations of this and other verses are, you help Allah by helping yourself assist His religion. So learn your religion, act upon that religion, and then call to it. And when the sufficient, a critical mass is reached, in Allah's wisdom, in His mercy and wisdom, He may decide to give you a state, either as a gift or as a test or for whatever it means. But either way, the obligation for us is not to establish the political power. Political power is the obligation upon what's known, the religious definition or Islamic definition would be Ahlul Halli wal Aqd, which means the people, essentially the movers and shakers, or the notables of society, the people of power and influence, that when they, and this could be generals, it could be industrialists, billionaires, powerful scholars, prime ministers, ministers, people who have access and speak on behalf, access to means, if you like, of statecraft and statehood, and that they have the numbers, the masses behind them. They represent the masses. So when they're in a situation when they can implement law and set up a state, then the obligation falls upon them. But it's asking way too much of the average Muslim to be stressed and to worry about establishing an Islamic state. We have our own battles to fight, and as it's often said, we need to establish the Islamic state upon ourselves, our own state of Islam within our hearts, within our households, and then we leave the rest to Allah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, inshallah, Abdur Rahman. Very well said. It's sometimes we lose sight of that. I mean, even speaking, for myself first and foremost. I mean, like having seen, the things that I've seen, having been Muslim for 18 years, like it really, just sometimes it distresses me that, with the Muslims as a whole, but also, vis-a-vis living in the West, are in such a difficult state, and the state of the dawah. So it can get very, distressing at times. But I mean, absolutely. I mean, if turning away, from the deen, or not, making yourself, right in your religion. I mean, if that's not there, if the foundation isn't there, then it's not going to be successful. I mean, it has to start, on an individual level. So yeah, I mean, it's important to keep in mind. I mean, it's easier. Like there's always a chance to, to turn back to Allah. I mean, we have, the internet at our fingertips, and we can read the Quran, at any time. But it's just getting down to it, just establishing that foundation, because otherwise it's just not going to move forward.
Yeah, as the scholars say, a child isn't born until after it's been carried in the womb for 9 months. A tree doesn't bear its fruit until it's been planted, started off as a seed. We can't fast track these things. The Islam and blessings of, if you want to call it that, of power, have to be earned. They can't be demanded, right? What was the Prophet wasn't just a carrier of revelation; he was an exemplifier of that revelation. So we saw the trials and the tribulations he went through, the suffering and the patience and the steadfastness, underlies with the steadfast. And so we can't expect to do anything any quicker or in a shortcut way that any of the prophets of the past or righteous people of the past didn't go through. So we should expect to be made to be honest for our claim to be believers. Okay, let's see your belief in action then. It can't be the case of, well, once I have the power at my disposal, whether that's through wealth or state, then I will show you my religion. No, we need to evidence our religion now. For those of us who live in non-Muslim majority societies, we have a huge obligation, a massive obligation to be ambassadors for the religion, to be good examples of Islam, to be carriers of messengers of that message. That's what we're going to be asked about, because that's within our gift to do. We're not going to be asked about something 1,000 miles away, which requires an army to fix, essentially, perhaps, or some serious international effort. We have the obligation to do dawah, to first and foremost rectify ourselves, reform ourselves, increase our own knowledge, fix our connection, our relationship with Allah, which is essentially why not essentially, that's absolutely the reason we've been created. Each and every one of us has been created, to serve and worship Allah. And so we can do that every day within the confines of our home, on the streets, in our workplace, in sports halls, wherever it might be. That's what we're going to be asked about, because that's within our power, within our grasp. And Allah does not burden a soul with more than it can bear.
Inshallah, brother. I mean, all really important reminders. I mean, I'm glad we had this, address these questions specifically. Do you have any? Well, just one more question before go into the next question on the list. Has there ever been like a time or an example that we can draw from in which we have? I mean, because now, I mean, we in the West, you're talking about individuals coming into Islam, and then unfortunately many of them are exiting as fast as they enter, and like we're in a time where like in the past, you had societies that converted to Islam, en masse, and that's usually normally what we think about when we think of Islam. And like you're talking about a totally different society in which there's the populations are generally homogenous, which with a few exceptions. Now we're kind of living in this kind of like globalized world in which we have access to the internet at our fingertips, but we're also incredibly like isolated. Is there any type of source or like books you can recommend that delve into, I guess, how Islam spread and like what like the process was for converts or things of that nature, or are we just dealing with something completely new? I mean, has there been any attempt to try to like apply Islamic history in the past to what's happening today, or is it just, are we dealing with a totally different kettle of fish?
We are in many ways. I mean, but still, we could mention some resources in the sense that if you're talking about generally how Islam spread, the one very good book was by the British polymath or English polymath Arnold. I forgot his name, first name. Is it anyway? Arnold. You can find it. It's called the Spread of Islam, something like that. Very easy to pick up. He was he wrote in the 19th century, if I'm not mistaken, or very early 20th century. So so as a historian, as a polymath, he brings in lots of interesting anecdotes as well as an broad overview of history, how Islam spread. In terms of retrospectively.
So sorry, brother. Thomas Walker Arnold, the Spread of Islam in the World.
That's the guy. Yeah.
We got to get that one.
Yeah. That's one of the oldest, and that was done. He was around at the time of the British Empire, so it was kind of very objective in that sense. He wasn't trying to please anyone. I can't recall if he became Muslim or not, but it's a good resource. I mean, there's so many books that look at it like at the specific level in terms of a particular group or continent or country, but in terms of retrospectively looking back and why Islam spread the way it did and what are the principles of success, Dr. Abu Mina Bilal Phillips many years ago did a essay on this, or a small thesis on this, and it was quite fascinating, and he mentioned I can't remember how many it was, half a dozen to a dozen points of how at the time of the Prophet and the companions, Islam spread. What were the things that helped Islam grow amongst the companions and then the generations after them? So he mentioned things like marriage. He mentioned the dawah itself. He mentioned how certain leaders of communities would have an impact on their tribe should they become Muslim, and many of things like this. And he went into detail, referencing to the Quran, Sunnah. So that's very, very interesting. Of course, if you have a state behind you, or let's say an NGO with significant resources, then they can do a lot. So you would have mass conversions often when you had a state overpowering, if you like, a community, then they would have little recourse except to that state for their well-being. And often it was presented that the reason you're being treated so well, and in fact it was unspoken, if you like, the reason you're being treated so well is because we're Muslims. This is what Muslims do. We're going to look after you. Just behave yourselves and everything else will be rosy. And when the people saw the justice of Islam, then they would embrace Islam en masse. But that's not the only time you would have mass conversions. You also had mass conversions even in the colonial period. What I mean by that is when non-Muslims were colonizing Muslim areas, you still had mass conversions. And most famously and significantly, perhaps, was in the East Indies, in the Indonesian archipelago, where the majority of the people become Muslims, whilst they were under Dutch and other colonial rule. And again, it's a lot has to be said for how those Muslims who were presenting Islam to them, those carriers of Islam. You saw the same again in the former Soviet Union under Catherine the Great. You had mass conversions. Ironically, she'd conquered Muslim lands, but because of the way she set up the administration, the Muslims there undertook dawah outreach efforts, and they managed to convert a lot of those who were prior to that had been pagans. Likewise, even under the Mongols, on one hand they came to destroy Islam, but then they also thought they would, using the divide and conquer maxim, they would take Muslim governors to govern non-Muslim parts of China. Famously, Yunnan, you had 2 Persian Muslim engineers, and they were very, mashallah, loyal to their religion, and they happened to convert through their outreach efforts the majority of the population of Yunnan. Till this day, You have Yunnan having an indigenous Han that's actually Chinese as opposed to Uyghur or non-Han Chinese if you like, Muslim majority. So it could happen with it through the power of a state. It could happen through the power of the power, but let's say the benefit of the activities of du'at individuals, and we see that even now. You find, for example, in Malawi, in the Philippines that I know of, you have what you could class as mass conversions. You know, a few hundred people taking shahada at one instance, at one moment. 500 people in the Philippines within the last 2 years in one sitting, if you like. And alhamdulillah, it shows that we really have no excuse, you know, to invite people to Islam. It doesn't necessarily require always a lot of money, a lot of power behind it. Sincerity is most important, and then knowledge, knowing how to convey with wisdom and fair preaching the message of Islam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, alhamdulillah. I mean, we see Islam growing throughout the world. I even saw a documentary on Muslims from the Tzotzil tribe in Chiapas in Mexico. It's very interesting. There's hundreds of these Muslims from this tribe in Mexico after I think the Zapatista rebels or Islamic missionaries, and they've kept the same language, the same culture, the same dress, the same cuisine. But they're Muslims. So it's very interesting to see. So yeah, alhamdulillah. I mean, it's and that these are good reminders. I mean, it gives us hope that Islam is still spreading, and it's still something that people can see the benefit in. So inshallah, may Allah reward us for our humble efforts and keep everyone steadfast on the deen. Did you have any questions specifically for me, for Islam for Europeans, or any comments about how the channel is going, or critique, or what recommendations you have for us moving forward, just so we stay on the right path, or do you or off the top of your head, or do you think we're doing a good job so far?
Well, I think the topic we've just covered is perhaps what's missing, or at least what needs to be um, accentuated a lot more, and that people will be attracted to any project if it actually seems to have a Islamic knowledge base and is calling to Islam. Activism has its place, no doubt, but people will gravitate, and it's a good thing. They will gravitate towards scholarship, towards authority, a presentation of authority in teaching Islam. Because, of course, once a person becomes a Muslim or lapsed Muslim returns to their religion, they want to actually study it. They want to learn. So having that in situ, in-house resource, whether that's in terms of pamphlets or videos or what would you call it, seminars or meetings or whatever it might be, if you actually have some kind of in-house teaching, courses of Islam, resources, that's certainly going to help take it from beyond any project, that is taking it beyond an interest activity to something which will keep people. It's retention, as you know, is the biggest problem now with people who convert. It's retention, and the way we can mitigate against deflection or apostasy is by making people feel that they are very much certain. It's doubt that takes a person out of Islam. So to give that person certainty, that comes with knowledge and practice, of course, but knowledge comes before the practice. So if there is those kind of programs, dawah programs, or going through certain texts, seminal texts or teaching, then that will not only will it keep any non-Muslim who converts to Islam through the organization, keep them on board, but it will bring people, Muslim, whether born Muslims or otherwise, to a project, because they know that there's something for them as well. There's learning for them.
Yeah, I mean, the more knowledge you have on Islam, the better chance you have of keeping people in the deen. I mean, just to give you one small example, there was one brother that I know who converted around the same time I did, and we were giving him, and this was right before Ramadan started, right? So we were trying to give him some books and pamphlets and stuff on Islam, but he didn't really understand all the rules of Ramadan. So I remember one time I called him and I said, how is the fasting going? And he said, oh, and sunset was at like 7:58 or 7:45 at that time. And he's like, oh, it's really difficult. I can only eat until like 9 o'clock, and it's been really a tough go. And I'm just like, what are you talking about? He said, well, I thought you had to wait until it was completely dark out. I'm like, no, we break our fast at sunset. It's not, you don't have to wait until it's completely dark in the sky. So that's just one small example. I mean, Allah made this deen, easy to do.
Yes.
So I guess, like if you don't have that religious foundation, it can seem insurmountable at times.
Yeah.
So, but no, I mean, we definitely want to have more. We want to start doing start having Islam 101 videos, here on the channel. So at the very least, we can provide that to people so they have like a good, religious foundation. And, alhamdulillah, I'm glad we were able to respond to that one non-Muslim who had all those tough questions about Islam. So yeah, more stuff like that. I mean, the current events and, like dealing with things as a convert, particularly a European descendant convert, I think those are important. But it's necessary, but not sufficient, as you said. Yeah. But yeah, any new future plans for Knowledge North? Or what are you trying to delve into next? What topics for the videos for Knowledge North?
It's a struggle. just finishing off the existing playlist, because in order to keep interest, you have to spice them up, as it were, in terms of the visuals.
Yeah.
So it takes a lot of time. In terms of the actual narrative, I've got literally years worth. It's just putting it into format, visually entertaining and engaging format. So once the existing playlists are done, I want to move into something quite controversial, which is Jihad and Geopolitics, something that hasn't been covered, and perhaps people would shy away from it because there's a risk potentially, with knocks on the door. But I think I've got that base covered. So there's that, and then I want to the structure basically of the site is, in my research over the years, I found that there's all doubts, all things that affect a Muslim in terms of potentially harming or decreasing their convictions in their religion, or that might dissuade a non-Muslim from looking into Islam. All of these doubts can be summarized into three parts. One is this, and this is how the structure of the playlist basically works. So the first one would be that Islam is in conflict with science and rationale, with intellect and science. So that's the first doubt, which we hope to dispel, and that playlist is complete. The second one is that, building on from that, Islam is a failed civilization. So we're answering that in the second playlist. And then the third one, which I hope to start once the second one is done, and I branched off into the second, into the Ottomans and various other things. The third one would be Islam is in need of reform. And again, these are the doubts, and we are answering those doubts by saying it's not. This is why it's not, because it has within itself the capacity to reform, but it's upon us, the Muslims, to do what they're supposed to be doing in order for Islam to flourish upon them and in the wide society. So that's the next playlist to do.
Well, inshallah, I hope I'm looking forward to those videos. It's really important stuff. I mean, just one point that you talked, the last point that you mentioned, I mean, without knowing what fiqh is or Islamic jurisprudence, I mean, like people can just take one hadith willy-nilly and just say, this is what Islam says about this at all times in all situations. And we see non-Muslims doing this, and that deters them from Islam. But it also, Muslims who are, not really well knowledgeable, it can really shake their faith. So
yeah,
understanding that is just it's so incredibly important.
Yeah, we're in an artificial setup in terms of knowledge now, in the sense that for the bulk of the 14th century of Islam, texts of knowledge, like you mentioned, hadith, they weren't in everyone's homes. First of all, prior to the printing press, you just couldn't, you couldn't do that. You'd have to copy a manuscript, and very few people necessarily were literate. And of those literate, very few people necessarily, or let's say minority anyway, could afford to get someone to copy a manuscript for them. So people did not have access to hadith, except the scholars, except the elites. So the average person wouldn't go and pick out a hadith and make fatwas or religious edicts and rulings from it, which could then lead to certain problems, of course, be it in terms of violence or oppression or excess or being lackadaisical or whatever it might be, heresy. So this is a new phenomenon now and it's kind of double-edged sword, that everyone has access to every single book of hadith ever written by going on to Google and Googling it. But that comes with a huge responsibility. None of this knowledge, as we said, although it should be accessible to the public, they should have a filter of an expert, just like you and I know this is a bit of a cliche, but it's worth repeating. You and I would not pick up a book of brain surgery and think, now I can go and cut up on someone's head and do it. It requires, the expert to train you in that text over potentially decades, and having peer review. And then once you've passed certain exams and qualifications and got your wings through the wards, then they will maybe allow you to touch that scalpel. It's even more so imperative that we have that kind of training and that kind of those measures in terms of knowledge. Why? Because you may not just destroy your life, you may destroy your hereafter if you and other people's hereafter if you give dodgy fatwa or the wrong religious guidance. But again, it's a blessing in this. The literacy of people nowadays is a blessing. The accessibility of knowledge is a blessing, but it comes with a huge responsibility.
Has there been any efforts to synthesize, at like top Islamic levels, to synthesize, I guess, kind of like things that are like a consensus, like a ijma between the scholarships, and putting it down into like an electronic format, where you can say, okay, these are the scholars that agree with this opinion, so that it's more easily referenceable. I know that sounds like a tough endeavor, and it may actually, like do more harm than good if improperly applied. But we live in the age of TikTok, where people want an answer in 2 seconds.
Yeah.
And if we're going up against a whole bunch of anti-Islam books and websites and videos, and for Muslims to easily go to a reference where you can say, this is what Islam says about these important topics, like you said, jihad or things like that. I mean, even those questions, they're so comprehensive. It depends on the time and the place and the situation. Is that sort of like, is that something that people are talking about at that level, or is it just something that's just not even on Muslim scholars' radar? Because a lot of this is just trying, not only understanding different opinions and scholarly opinions, but getting that information out to the general public. So
well, you have, at one level, you do have works where, for example, there's a book that I kind of organized a translation of back in the day, where it mentioned all of the fiqh or jurisprudential issues where the 4 imams or founders of the schools of Islamic jurisprudence, Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Shafi, and Ahmed bin Hanbal, everything where they united upon in their fiqh in terms of prayer, hajj, etc. There's that. So the consensus in that regard, you can find individual efforts. As for an entire consensus on every aspect of Islam, obviously that's quite a significant effort. But in some ways, what you mentioned just before that would impact upon that and would make it perhaps in some ways not advisable, in the sense that, like, fiqh is a living thing, and it depends often on where you are, your society, your surroundings. And so a ruling, a consensus for a particular time and place may not be appropriate for another time and place, or for particular people. It may apply them, it might not apply to us. So jihad, for example, the rules of jihad would make sense perhaps in the Middle Ages for a Muslim state. They can't be applied by organizations today. It'd be a very but that doesn't mean that we still can't, that the implications upon us shouldn't be studied, or there's no benefit to be derived. But it's not a one size fits all. So really, I would say, not as a way of as a cop out, but just to be more careful, rather than letting people think that they could apply consensus on everything. Certainly in terms of creed and foundation, there is consensus, and we should strive to find out what those consensuses are. What we need to do as Muslims, how to believe in Allah, how to worship Allah, and our basic rights and responsibilities upon our families and our societies. That we should seek that knowledge, and there's really no difference. Most of these things or many of these things are known by necessity, and if not, then they can be known by a bit of diligence. But beyond that, in terms of the general more broader issues, in terms of dawah as well, and if you like polemics and dispelling doubts, then this requires some active work, and that's hence projects, inshallah, like ours, that we need to maybe lay the groundwork and answer doubts that haven't. I mean, all doubts essentially are regurgitations of things that people have presented in the past, but perhaps they have to be presented in a new way or with new reference points to make it relevant.
Mm-hmm. Inshallah, that'll happen. I'm glad that people are actually talking about it. So like like we can help the the Ummah move forward and become more solidified in their faith. One more question before I know you have to go soon, but one more question, Abdur Rahman. It's the name of your your YouTube channel is Knowledge North, which you said before is because you live in the north of England, I believe.
Yeah.
What's the vibe there, like in northern England? Like, are Muslims and non-Muslims, do they live in kind of like their own societies, or is it more integrated? Like what can a Muslim expect? Like visiting northern England or moving there.
I mean, the part where I'm, the northeast, it's fairly well integrated. You have areas in the northwest which, and sometimes maybe there's an element of exaggeration, but you do have like more ghettoized, demographics. That's not so much the case here. Generally, it's quite mixed in terms of housing and things like that, for the most part. Although you do have clusters, and that's natural, I guess. Families will tend to stay close to each other because of convenience of certain shops and whatnot. But I mean, I can only speak for the UK and Eastern Europe. As for Western Europe, France and Germany, etc., I've only passed through them. But you hear things. You hear not good things, like the certain parts of, I know the term, certain parts of Paris on the outskirts, these kind of places. They seem like very nasty places for non-Muslims and Muslims who might be religiously inclined. So we don't have it like that as is reported, that bad in the UK, thank God, and long may that continue. And part of that has to be said for the Anglo-Saxon mindset. They kind of pride themselves on being truly tolerant, as opposed to on paper tolerant. And this is something that happened with the niqab ban, whether one believes in the niqab being obligatory, not even useful or not. That's the side point. The point is that when this ban was legislated or being discussed in France, you had conservative, and by conservative, let's think in terms of North American terms, Republican, if you like, right? Either non-liberal politicians saying, we would never do that in our country. We're not like those French. We are truly, they took it as a symbol of pride that the British don't tell women how to dress. If you want to cover, you don't cover, that's entirely up to you. So that's a good thing about the British, that they do have this kind of, perhaps laissez-faire, to borrow the French term, if I pronounce that right.
Yeah,
I think good. Part of that may be just due to their history from way back when to the Crusades, although the French also shared that history and in some ways were more instrumental until Richard the Lionheart got involved. But since that time, they've known about Muslims, known how to interact with Muslims, and there is a significant degree of sophistication at all levels of all strata of society, including the establishment, of understanding Islam and the nuances, even in terms of the sects. In fact, they helped create some of the sects of Islam in India in order to help, aid the colonial effort. But because of that, today, what that means is that people generally are tolerant. The problem is, of course, us Muslims, how are we capitalizing on that tolerance in terms of being good neighbors, good Muslims, presenting Islam while we can, because God knows, it may reach a time where you can't preach Islam, or you can't, freely integrate. I'm not thinking about a doomsday scenario, but in Bosnia, if they were told prior to the Bosnia war that neighbors would have the knives out for each other, it would have been something unfathomable. I don't believe it will happen, inshallah, it won't happen, but still, while we have that opportunity, while the people are able to read and willing to read and willing to visit and enjoy exotic food, it's a good time to seize the opportunity to present Islam. especially as it's always in the media now, but for good reasons or bad reasons. Islam and Muslims are always in the news, so we should capitalize on that and give a good impression.
Inshallah, may Allah assist the efforts there. I mean, yeah, I mean, we have a tendency to look at just the negative stories that we see on social media or people's tweets, and that gives us like the sort of bias where we only see the bad. But I'm sure that Muslims at either at an individual level or a group level, like have invited the native British to learn about Islam, and or even, I don't know, do you find that it's that even people, you can even reach people in the EDL, or are they just just beyond any type of group dialogue or anything like that? Or
Well, I would say Islam, we need to appeal to the lowest common denominator. So just because a person may be racist, may be misogynist, may be sectarian, even within the Muslims, they may have issues. The truth is not the preserve of you and I. It's a gift from Allah. Light is something that doesn't diminish if it's shared. So long as we've conveyed the message, have they understood Tawheed? Have they understood the call to worship Allah and His oneness and rejected it? If they've rejected it after having understood it, without us putting any barriers between us and them, and that could be a racial barrier, then fine, okay, we'll part our ways. And even then, that doesn't mean to say someone else shouldn't try, right? But that is the issue. If a non-Muslim rejects Islam for anything other than the message, then that means we failed collectively, and that we need to make sure that they reject it, not because of what they see in the media, not because of skin color or whatever it might be, opposing football teams. It has to be because they've understood it. The hujjah, as we say, the conclusive proof has been established and rejected it. But as an anecdote, just to inshallah, as a positive note, perhaps to end on, something very, very current, we had yesterday, was it yesterday or the night before, Tyson Fury won his third fight against Deontay Wilder, the American. You will find, and the other great British boxing hero is Anthony Joshua, although he lost his last fight. Both of these are non-Muslim men, but if you look into, and it's not difficult to find, their own speeches about Muslims and Islam, it's extremely positive because they've had very positive interactions, and that's very important, within their own staff, that is their own team. And so you'll find even pictures of the both of them wearing the thobe, that is the kind of tunic, which is similar to how the Prophet used to dress, wearing the kufi, which is this kind of skull cap, not mandatory, but it's from Muslim, certain Muslim clothing cultures, and having their hands open as if they are supplicating in the way Muslims do, and they will say very positive things about Islam. Both of them have said this, and both of them have been grateful for the interaction, the positive interaction they've had from Muslim colleagues and family members, in fact, even family members in terms of Anthony Joshua, despite there being, card-carrying Christians. So that just goes to show how, despite whatever the media might say or whatever negative impression is presented, at the grassroots level, even with these celebrity examples, you can find that when the Muslims are able to present themselves to a non-Muslim in a positive way, positive interaction, then it helps the image of Islam, and that could have huge ripple effects. As one comedian, Stuart, I forgot his name, Stuart something, escapes me, he said, of course, like every Englishman, I hate all Muslims apart from those I've actually met. So that's what we ought to do. We have to try to be those good Muslims that people meet.
Yeah, inshallah. I mean, being a convert, you see it firsthand. Like your entire society is non-Muslims, and like it has. Trust me, the work that the Muslims are doing, I know they don't see it firsthand sometimes, but it really has a good, deep impression on. I mean, just look at the people we've been trying to reach out to in the dissident right. Ed Dutton said that his interactions with Muslims, even at a young age, when he was a kid, was very positive. His mother, he had Muslim babysitters, and and the ones who had less than favorable interactions with Muslims, they're the ones who end up, like being the most hardcore against them. So,
right.
Yeah, but inshallah, may Allah reward us for our humble efforts in that regard, and let us continue to, be good ambassadors to our religion. But I just, Jazakallah khair for this great conversation, Abdur Rahman. I'm glad we're able to finally get around to it. Did you have any other closing comments? Do you want to talk about give the link to your channel, and I'll put it in the video chat as well. But did you have any other things you wanted to advertise?
No, inshallah. Just hopefully the listeners could, if there's Muslims amongst them, keep us in their prayers. And if there's any non-Muslims, then do access first and foremost the Quran. Get a translation. There's plenty out there, and many of them you can get for free. And judge Islam, not by what you might see in terms of negative images, but understand those positive images. They are due to the wisdom and the mercy and the justice that is replete throughout the Quran and in the prophetic example. So do access the Quran and try to learn about the Prophet Muhammad, and then you will have a better understanding. And if you can meet a Muslim, a good practicing Muslim, male or female, whether in a mosque or outside, do so, inshallah, and that maybe will help us all unite upon something good. And the channel is youtube.com/knowledge north, one word, quite easy to figure out, but the link will be there, inshallah.
Inshallah. Okay. That's our time for today. I'm Robert from Islam for Europeans. Please subscribe to Knowledge North and Islam for Europeans if you haven't done so already. Thank you very much for listening. And a big thanks to Brother Abdur Rahman from Knowledge North. I'm your host, Robert Dufour. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.